Now let's see what happens when we have a separate single worker process, let's call it worker 0, that's responsible for fetching data from the dataset. This can be configured when we are instantiating the DataLoader object. One of the parameters of the DataLoader object is the num workers, which is the number of subprocessors to use for data loading. The default value is 0, which means everything is happening in process, which is what we saw in the last video. And in this example that we're looking at now, we are setting the num workers to 1. Another useful parameter to look at is the prefetch factor. And it has a default value of 2 when the number of workers is greater than 0. And all this is saying is that the data loader will keep 2 batches per worker in its buffer. So in our case, we just have a single worker. And so at all times, our data loader is going to keep 2 batches in its buffer ready to serve to the trainer. So here, let's write our prefetch factor as 2. Now when the train.py calls next on the data loader's iterator, the data loader will go get the indices of the first batch as usual, which is what it wants to serve right now. But it will also go and get the indices of the next 2 batches that it needs to keep in its buffer. Now the data loader asks the worker to fetch the first batch from its local copy of the dataset, and then the other 2 batches without waiting for the first batch to make its way to the trainer. And after the first batch has been yielded to the trainer, the data loader still has 2 batches in its buffer as we intended. When train.py calls next on the data loader's iterator again, the data loader has the second batch ready to yield, and it yields that. But now it has an empty spot in its buffer that it needs to fill with another batch. And so it gets the next batch from the batch sampler and asks the worker to fetch this next batch from its dataset and is again ready with 2 batches in its buffer. Let's see this in code. So I've created a new file called multiworker.py, and I am going to copy the contents of the InProc Worker.py that we saw in the last video as is to this new file. The first thing I'm going to change here is the log function so that I know which process is logging this message. For this, I'm going to use a new API called getWorkerInfo. Let's head over to its documentation. And we can see that this returns information about the current worker process. With this, we can get the ID of this worker, the total number of workers in the system, any random seed that this worker might have been initialized with, and a copy of the dataset that this worker had. And when called in the main process, this function will just return a none. Now we'll set the color of the output based on the ID of the worker. So each worker process will print out its message in a different color. And then I'll also print out the worker ID and the total number of workers in the system, so I know which worker is printing this message. The second change I'm going to make is called the data loader with 1 worker with a prefetch factor of 2. Running this, we see that the behavior is similar to the InProc Worker module that we saw in the last video. Here too, the main process is stopping after getting the first batch, but the output here is much more interesting. We see that the main process has a process ID of 9696 and the worker process has a process ID of 9698. Further, we can see that this is 1 out of 1 worker. And even though our main process has iterated through the data loader just once, the data loader has asked the batcher for IDs of 3 batches. Why 3? Because it has to yield the first batch immediately, and a prefetch factor of 2 tells it to keep 2 batches ready in its buffer. And while all of this is happening in the main process, the data loader is simultaneously asking the worker process to go fetch the data corresponding to these IDs. And finally, the main process gets the first batch and waits for me to press enter. When I iterate through the data loader a second time, it immediately yields the second batch that was already in its buffer. But now it has only one extra batch in its buffer. So it goes and gets another batch to maintain a prefetch factor of 2. Now we can play around with these two parameters. Just remember that the total number of batches in the buffer will be num workers times the prefetch factor. If I make this 2, I'll have 4 batches in my buffer. Let's check. And sure enough, I asked for this batch, but the DataLoader went and got 4 extra batches. And it got this batch from this blue worker, right? 3, 4, and 5. It got this batch from the green worker again, right? 6, 7, and 8. And finally, the 9, 10, 11 batch was obtained from the blue worker again.